There is a specific kind of pain that nobody warns you about, not the pain of being misunderstood, not the ordinary loneliness of feeling different from the people around you. Something more precise than that. Something that arrives not when you fail, but when you see accurately, when you name what is actually happening in a room, when you sense the grief beneath someone's composure, or the resentment beneath their warmth, when you see through the performance that everyone else has silently agreed to applaud, and instead of being thanked for that clarity, you are punished for it. Not always loudly, not always with cruelty that announces itself as cruelty. Sometimes the punishment is a shift in the room's temperature when you enter it, a conversation that closes the moment you ask the question no one else was willing to ask. A slow, quiet transformation in which the people who once called you perceptive begin to call you difficult. Not because you changed, because what you see became inconvenient. If you have lived this, if you have carried the specific weight of seeing what the people around you had collectively agreed not to see, Carl Jung spent decades building a framework precise enough to explain exactly what is being done to you and why, and more importantly, what you are meant to do with what you carry. What you are about to hear is not comfort. It is something more useful than comfort. It is clarity about a pattern so consistent across human psychology that Jung treated it not as an unfortunate social dynamic, but as a psychological law. Jung made a distinction early in his career that most of his contemporaries were not prepared to take seriously. He insisted that the unconscious was not merely a personal phenomenon. It was not simply the reservoir of an individual's repressed memories and unprocessed emotions. It operated at a collective level. Groups, families, organizations, entire cultures developed a shared unconscious life, a set of agreements about what could be seen and what must remain unseen, what could be named and what must stay buried beneath the ordinary surface of daily life. He borrowed a term from the French anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl to describe the mechanism behind this. He called it participation mystique. It appears throughout his psychological types and across his later collected works, and it describes something Jung observed not as a primitive phenomenon belonging to earlier cultures, but as the default condition of most human beings in most social contexts. Participation mystique is the state of being psychologically merged with the collective. The individual does not experience themselves as fully separate from the group mind. They feel what the group feels. They believe what the group believes. Most critically, they do not see what the group has agreed not to see. The agreement is never made in language. There is no meeting, no declaration, no conscious negotiation. It forms at the level of the shared unconscious. The family does not discuss what is hollowing out its center. The organization does not name what its leadership is doing to what was built. The group does not acknowledge the relationship at its heart that has become predatory. The agreement is simply this: we do not see this. And everyone submerged in participation, mystique honors that agreement without ever having chosen to. The highly perceptive person is not submerged. They never were, or they broke free so early that they cannot remember what submersion felt like. Their psychological constitution is simply not built for the kind of merger that participation mystique requires. They cannot unsee what they see. They cannot unfeel what they feel. The collective agreement to maintain blindness is not available to them as an option. And this, Jung documented with precision, is not experienced by the group as a neutral difference. It is experienced as a threat. In Ion and across his writings on the shadow, Jung described the mechanism with the directness he reserved for observations he considered psychologically foundational. The shadow is everything the persona, the social mask, excludes. Everything deemed unacceptable, inconvenient, too dark or too bright to be acknowledged in the managed presentation of the self. The shadow does not disappear because it is excluded. It accumulates. It builds pressure. And under sufficient pressure, it does what Jung observed it doing in case after case, in culture after culture, across the full span of his clinical life. It projects. The shadow does not announce itself. It does not say, "I am the grief this family refuses to feel. I am the dysfunction this organization will not name." It simply finds a carrier. It finds the person in the room who cannot pretend, the person whose clear, honest, involuntary perception makes the shadow visible simply by reflecting it. And once the shadow has found its carrier, the group, with the unconscious precision that governs all collective behavior, begins to treat that carrier as the source of what they merely revealed. Jung called this the scapegoat dynamic. It is not metaphor. It is a documented psychological law. The person whose perception is clearest becomes the container for everything the group refuses to own about itself. They are not targeted because they did something wrong. They are targeted because they see something true, and the collective, in its unconscious wisdom, understands that as long as this person is present and trusted, the shadow has somewhere to be reflected rather than somewhere to hide. So the language shifts, the energy shifts. The person who was valued for their awareness is suddenly described as difficult. Their observations become drama. Their accuracy becomes arrogance. Their honesty becomes a form of aggression against the fragile peace that the collective has built on top of its unexamined foundations. And the most disorienting feature of this experience is one Jung returned to repeatedly. The more accurately you perceive what is being done to you, the more isolated you become in that perception. Because naming the scapegoat mechanism to the people enacting it is itself experienced as an attack. The mirror does not get thanked for what it reflects. It gets broken. Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion that the psychological rule is that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. The group that will not look at its own shadow does not stop being shaped by it. It simply stops being responsible for it. It assigns responsibility instead to the person it has chosen to carry what it will not examine. There is a second dimension to this that Jung identified, and that most accounts of this experience miss entirely. The persona, the mask built from everything the world rewarded and punished, does not only protect the individual who wears it, it protects the collective that depends on everyone wearing theirs. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung described the persona as the individual system of adaptation to the world. It is not pathological in itself. It is necessary. The danger he identified is what happens when the mask is mistaken for the face, when the performance of the self becomes indistinguishable from the self that is performing. The highly perceptive person sees through the mask involuntarily. They are not trying to expose anyone. They are simply present in the way that a person is present before they have learned to perform presence. And that involuntary seeing is experienced by the person being seen as a form of violation, not because anything was taken from them, because something was seen that they needed to remain unseen in order to continue functioning as the person their mask promised they were. This is the collision Jung spent years trying to name. Not a conflict between people, a collision between an unusually developed capacity for psychological truth and a social world that has organized itself around psychological avoidance. The suffering that results is not a pathology. It is not a sign that something is wrong with the person doing the seeing. It is the entirely predictable consequence of full, honest presence in a space that experiences full, honest presence as a form of threat. But Jung was not a theorist of suffering. He was a clinician of transformation, and he was clear that understanding this mechanism, as necessary as that understanding is only the first movement of the work, because there is a danger waiting for the perceptive person on the other side of finally understanding what has been done to them. Jung called it psychic inflation, and he documented it with particular care in 2 essays on analytical psychology because he had watched it derail the development of people who had come further than almost anyone else along this path. Psychic inflation is what happens when the ego, having survived the punishment, having finally built enough interior ground to stand on, begins to mistake the scope of what it has achieved. The perceptive person stops apologizing for what they see. That is necessary and good. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the awareness that was once a wound begins to feel like a mandate. They begin to experience their clarity not as a faculty they exercise, but as a calling they embody. They become impatient with unconsciousness in exactly the way the unconscious collective was impatient with their consciousness. They correct, they instruct. They begin to wield what they see rather than offer it. Jung wrote that the moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has been possessed by the very forces one sought to understand. The protection against inflation is not to doubt the perception. The perception is real. The protection is shadow integration. And here is the paradox Jung placed at the center of this entire terrain. The people who see other people's shadows most clearly are very often the people who have spent the least time sitting honestly inside their own. You can map the manipulation in a relationship with devastating accuracy. Can you see the moments when your own need for control expressed itself as manipulation? You can sense arrogance in a room before a word has been spoken. Do you have access to the moments when your certainty about what you perceived crossed the line into superiority? Shadow integration does not ask you to doubt your gifts. It asks you to be as honest about yourself as you are precise about others. To apply the same differentiated perception inward that you have spent your whole life applying outward. Because the only perception that does not distort is the perception that has been honest about the distortions in its own lens. Jung described this in his writings on conscious suffering, the willingness to feel fully what is present without collapsing under it or numbing it away. He distinguished it carefully from neurotic suffering, which circles the wound without ever entering it. Conscious suffering enters. It sits inside the discomfort of self-examination without demanding that the discomfort resolve quickly. It is, Jung believed, the most accelerating factor available in genuine psychological transformation, not because pain is valuable in itself, because the willingness to remain present inside difficulty rather than manage it from a safe distance is what makes genuine change possible rather than merely theoretical. The final movement Jung mapped on this terrain is the one he called the transcendent function, described in Collected Works, Volume 8, and it is the destination that makes everything that preceded it intelligible. The transcendent function is not a technique. It is what becomes possible when the perceptive person has done the shadow work, has integrated what they carry, has stopped being driven by their clarity and begun working consciously with it. The perception does not diminish. It never diminishes. They still see the architecture of a room's unspoken dynamics. They still feel the grief beneath composure and the resentment beneath warmth. But they carry what they see with an ease that was not previously available to them. There is no performance of consciousness, no compulsion to name what they perceive or force it into awareness. No need for the world to confirm what they already know. The vision is held with the patience of someone who understands that consciousness does not travel by imposition. It travels by encounter, by the genuine meeting between a person who is ready to see and a person who has learned to hold what they see with grace rather than urgency. Jung believed, by the end of his clinical life, that the people who successfully integrate this level of perceptive capacity serve a function that extends beyond their own psychological development. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote that the individual is always the carrier of the living spirit, the one in whom genuine change in the collective begins. The person who has done this work does not carry the collective shadow as a burden. They carry the consciousness the collective is not yet capable of holding for itself, and they carry it not as a wound they manage or an identity they defend, but as a quality of presence, something that operates before language, before explanation, before any deliberate act of communication. Light does not announce itself, it simply illuminates. What you carry is not a defect in the design. It has never been a defect in the design. The capacity to see what others cannot is not a malfunction or a wound or a sensitivity in need of management. It is a function, a necessary, irreplaceable function that every healthy collective requires, and that every unhealthy collective will always move to suppress. The goal is not to see less. Jung arrived at this conclusion again and again across the full arc of his career. The goal is not to protect yourself from what you see, or to be consumed by it, or to perform it for a world that will punish you for the performance. The goal is to become the kind of person who can carry it fully, honestly, without apology, and without inflation. With the humility of someone who has sat inside their own shadow and found it as human as everything they have ever seen in others. And with the confidence of someone who has passed through the difficulty and emerged not hardened, whole. Drop one word in the comments that describes what it has cost you to see clearly. Just one word. You will find you are not alone in what you name. If someone in your life is carrying this same weight and does not yet have the language for it, share this with them. Not to explain it, just so they know the framework exists.